Welcome again to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. I've called today's video, quote unquote, multiple attestation, end quote, is not a knight on a white horse. So I'll be explaining what all of that means, why I have the scare quotes around multiple attestation, and what I mean by trying to treat, quote unquote, multiple attestation as a knight on a white horse. So here's what I have in mind. I have in mind a situation where scholars will portray documents in a certain way. Maybe they're granting it for the sake of the argument, or in other cases, maybe they're actually saying that this is what the documents are like. So either way. And these concessions or these other statements about the nature of the documents change the background situation and call into question quite a lot of what is written in the documents. And then the same scholar who has done this will attempt to salvage some of what's in those documents by pointing to the fact that several different documents all directly or indirectly seem to endorse the same proposition, either the same event or some motif, some broader category like, it was possible to touch Jesus, alluded to in multiple stories, so there's that motif, or something of that kind. And the fact that it's in multiple of these documents will then be used to say, so that's okay, that's secure, that's factually accurate, despite the other methodological concessions that have already been made. And so I'm going to be arguing that that does not work when you do it that way. So I'm going to start, as I often do, with a illustration. Suppose that we had 3 documents, or even 4, that were stories of the life of George Washington. And suppose that even 1 or 2 of these came from Washington's own time, and one of them was overseen by someone who had actually known Washington. But the others weren't, let's just say. But anyway, the point is these are all about the life of George Washington, and let's suppose that I'm a historian and a scholar of George Washington studies, and I say that I think I have separate reason to think that all of these documents are in a genre such that the authors felt free to craft their stories sometimes, to change things from the way that they actually happened, even though they're writing seamlessly. So they're partially literally factual, they're partially not literally factual, and we just have to kind of conjecture to try to figure out which parts are which. And that's the nature of them, even the ones written by contemporaries of Washington or friends of Washington. Now let's suppose that all of these documents contain some version of the story of the cherry tree. And you're familiar with that story where the young George Washington cuts down a cherry tree, and then his father, the person that owns the tree, asks him, did he do that? And he says, I cannot tell a lie, I cut it down with my little axe. Okay, and they all contain some version of this. There are variations. In one of them, he's 10 years old. Another, he's 15. And in one of them, it's his uncle who owns the cherry tree. And the other one, it's his father, etc. But all of the documents contain some version of this cherry tree story. And let's say that I've also specifically drawn attention to the youth of George Washington and to the time period here surrounding that cherry tree story as a time when it's especially likely, a section of these documents where it's especially likely that they would make these modifications and these changes. Like I've drawn attention to that. And maybe to, differences between them. And I've said that this may be where they're using the freedom of this genre to craft. But then I say, well, they all tell some version of the cherry tree story. So that's multiply attested, and then that means that that's pretty secure. That's pretty decent evidence that the young George Washington really cut down a cherry tree and really did say, I cannot tell a lie, because they all have some version of it. Would that work? I'm going to say the answer is no, for several reasons. First of all, I have not established the relevant kind of independence. I have, in fact, undermined the relevant kind of independence because I've said that they are the kind of documents that feel free to craft. Now, the point isn't that they're all just making up the cherry tree story without any explanatory connection. But given the way that I've portrayed these documents, it's entirely plausible that there was simply some core tradition, some story floating around that George Washington cut down the cherry tree. And then these are the different authors' riffs, we might say, or embellishments upon that common core of tradition, which would then not be independent attestation to the facts. I'm going to emphasize in this video, it's very, very important to distinguish independent attestation to the facts from independent attestation to the existence of a story. It seems likely that all of these authors are somehow connected. Maybe the earliest one made up the story, again, on my view of what kind of documents these are, to illustrate George Washington's honesty, and then the other authors, still writing in this same partially factual genre, decided to take that story and modify it. Or it may be that there was some oral tradition where someone had made up this story, a source, and I've emphasized that they felt that they could do this kind of thing, and then these 3 or 4 different authors have used that common source in different ways. That's the way I've portrayed the nature of these documents methodologically, and so therefore I need to acknowledge the plausibility given my own previous statements that that's what's going on here, and that we don't have 4 different independent attestations that George Washington really chopped down the cherry tree. Okay, and said, I cannot tell a lie. There's also, of course, a motive, right, to illustrate that he was honest from the time that he was a child. And again, that's the kind of motive, let's say, that I as a scholar have alleged in other cases. Now let's see how this applies to the Gospels. I'm going to link below this an article that I wrote and was published in Themelios, a journal, about independent attestation and about the problem I'm talking about in this video, and the way that it's misused to try to sort of salvage something after methodological concessions have been made. In that article, one of the cases I talk about concerns the infancy narratives. And I'm also going to include a link to a written debate that was done between Bart Ehrman and Michael Licona several years ago. Ehrman was really pushing on the alleged contradictions between the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke. And Dr. Licona said something there, and I have an exact quotation in the Themelios article, and you can find it as well in the link, to the effect that he doesn't know what's going on in the infancy narratives, but let's just suppose that very little was known. Of course, you know, if you're arguing that it's true, you can't say it's known, but very little was known, or probably should have said believed, by the time Matthew and Luke were writing about Jesus' infancy, but there were some facts that people were saying that the Christians believed, so this would be called a tradition, you could call it, that, for example, his mother was a virgin, his mother's name was Mary, he was born in Bethlehem, etc. His mother's husband's name was Joseph, and that sort of thing, these overlapping things. And then that Matthew and Luke used what he suggests there in this hypothetical theory would have been the genre of midrash to add things to the stories to make them more interesting, and that's how we get these different stories. And then he said, but even if this were the case, their overlap would be secure because it would be multiply attested because there are so many differences in the stories. Now, that doesn't work. That is absolutely a misguided, wrong, incorrect way to use multiple attestation. And by the way, multiple attestation and varied evidence and independence are all topics on which I have professionally published. I'm not just talking about Themelios, I'm talking about in philosophy journals and in probability theory. the theory that is being put forward there is not a theory of multiple attestation to the facts. It's a theory on which there's this floating tradition in the Christian community. And then what's independent is the creativity of the authors. So all they're doing is they're multiply attesting that they both know that there's this story floating around. But the independence there does not indicate two different lines that go back to what actually happened at Jesus' birth. So you really only have one source, which is this oral tradition, you might call it, within the Christian community to these overlapping facts. And however reliable that is however reliable it is, but this is not multiple attestation to the facts. And it's a real problem. And I think there's a confusion here between independent access to a single tradition and independent access to the facts. This has come up in other ways. Now, let me just review for you a little bit concerning the idea that John wrote the Gospel of John. As I discuss in The Eye of the Beholder, several scholars, including evangelicals, particularly Craig Evans and Dr. Licona, and to some extent Daniel Wallace as well, have all conjectured that John felt quite free to modify the synoptic tradition in ways that look factual but are not literally factual. So, for example, that you've got the saying in the Synoptic Gospels, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Dr. Wallace and Dr. Licona have suggested that John changed that to "I thirst." That's a pretty major modification there. Similarly, the Synoptic saying, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," supposedly John modified and changed to "It is finished." So notice that even though the beloved disciple says he was there, he was at the foot of the cross, that even that closeness to the facts does not allegedly, on this view of John, prevent him from feeling free to tell something about what happened there in a way that looks real, but that did not happen in a recognizable fashion. And this is one of the places where they misuse a term like paraphrase, because that's not a paraphrase. And there are other modifications. So, for example, Dr. Licona has suggested, and he's not the only person, this is a theory that's been out there for a while, that John invented, he doesn't use the word invent, but that's what it is, the place where Jesus breathes on his disciples and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." This, I want to note, is a resurrection appearance. But that John added that, and that's John's version of Pentecost, which of course is a completely different type of scene and occurs after Jesus has ascended into heaven. Also, in terms of the resurrection narratives, okay, in the book Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Licona draws a special attention to the resurrection narratives as being among those pericopes where he thinks we are more likely to find these compositional devices which involve changing what happened. So again, even if you say, well, he only has 19 pericopes, well, again, 19 pericopes is more than 19 propositions. Let's just start there. But also the resurrection narratives are especially drawn attention to among those pericopes. In fact, when it comes to the time when Mary Magdalene met Jesus, there are these alleged contradictions that you're probably familiar with that I've addressed elsewhere, where if you just read Matthew by itself, you might think that she was with the other women the whole time. And if you read John, you realize that she left the group. Matthew doesn't explicitly say that, though. So if you insist that she's with the other women, then you have a contradiction that she's meeting Jesus on the road when the women are running with great joy to tell the other disciples after seeing the angels, and then they see Jesus. Whereas in John, she appears to be alone. She's very sad. She's not on the road. She's near the tomb and weeping and meets Jesus. Now, explicitly, and I do mean explicitly, on pages 175 to 176, I believe, of Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Licona states that either Matthew or John has changed the way in which Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus. He uses the word relocated, but he also emphasizes the differences, some of the same differences I've just talked about, and he attributes them to crafting. He says this shows the extent to which one of the evangelists or the sources from which he drew felt free to craft the narrative. So he's portraying either Matthew or John, and he doesn't say which, he doesn't decide which there, as feeling free to alter rather strongly the circumstances in which Mary Magdalene encountered Jesus. Notice, too, that this melds two different appearances that appear to be different in the Gospels, different occasions, into one. So the grasping Jesus' feet, being able to touch them, these are now, on this view, not two different occasions when people were able to touch Jesus. They're just one. And then one or the other of the Gospel authors has just embellished the tradition, rather like the common tradition notion in the infancy narratives. Also, in a debate with Bart Ehrman, Dr. Licona has insisted that Luke geographically moved the first appearance after the resurrection of Jesus to his disciples from Galilee to Jerusalem. I'm going to be talking on another show about this in a little while. I'm not sure when that's going to come out. Now, this also changes the circumstances, because when they go to Galilee, they're expecting to see Jesus, whereas as Luke and John both tell their first meeting, they have the doors closed, they're indoors, they're in Jerusalem, they're not expecting to see Jesus, they're afraid, and Jesus suddenly appears among them. So that really changes things. Notice, too, that these are allegedly different occasions on which, if you look at the Gospels themselves, they would be different occasions on which Jesus invites people to touch him, because in John, you actually have two, both in Jerusalem. He appears, and then Thomas doesn't believe, and he appears a week later, invites Thomas to touch him. That's very hard to fit in if they first went to Galilee and saw him there. Thomas isn't going to walk to Galilee with them. And then in Luke, supposedly on the first occasion, he said, handle me and see, etc. That a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. So again, it's lessening the number of attestations to his being able to be touched, just on the theory as given. And it gives us a particular view of the authors as feeling free to make these changes. Nonetheless, in a recent dialogue with Cameron Bertuzzi, I believe it was on Capturing Christianity, there was a question and answer period. In that question and answer period, one of the viewers asked Dr. Licona, do you think that there is good evidence that Jesus was able to be touched and able to eat after his resurrection? And the answer he gave, and I'll try to link to the video in the show notes, was, well, it depends on who you think wrote the Gospel of John. If you think it was John the son of Zebedee, or he was overseeing it, that's pretty good, because he was one of Jesus' disciples. And then also we have his being able to be touched and eating in different stories in the Gospels, so that's multiple attestation. So that's pretty decent evidence. Presumably he would not consider that historical bedrock, because that needs to be acknowledged by a large majority of scholars, but he said it's pretty decent as evidence. Well, we've got a methodological problem now. One, concerning Johannine authorship. Much of the value of that has been stripped away by the view articulated elsewhere of John's feeling of freedom to change and adapt traditions and craft them, even for a time when he was present, namely the crucifixion. And secondly, independent attestation is not going to come in on a white horse and be truly independent when you have undermined the individual documents so radically and have thereby opened up by methodology the possibility that they're just riffing on a common tradition. And especially not when there's a potential motive waiting in the wings for that common tradition. So again, this is something that has been suggested specifically for Jesus' words on the cross, that there's this tradition, and John took it and radically changed it to "I thirst," even though that didn't happen. And in the resurrection narratives, that there was this occasion when supposedly Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, but either John or Matthew, both of whom are supposed to be disciples, has rather radically altered the circumstances. In that case, the question arises, why is it not, under these methodological assumptions, legitimate to suggest that either there was an oral tradition of the vague sort that Jesus was able to be touched, or that he was able to eat, and that Luke and John and Matthew simply riffed on that existing oral tradition in their own ways? Or we could suggest, with regard to eating, that the Lucan version was the first, and that Luke suggested this. Maybe he'd heard that Jesus had been able to eat, but he didn't know any details, so he weaves it into his narrative and narrates it in a way that seems realistic to him. And then that John was modifying the Lucan version the same way that John modified, allegedly, "My God, why have you forsaken me? And into your hands I commit my spirit," and turned it into the breakfast that Jesus offers to them by the Sea of Galilee. I could even play devil's advocate further on this. It's fish, that they give Jesus in Luke, and they've had a great catch of fish, but Jesus also has fish, which he feeds to them. Also, Luke specifically has another story of a great catch of fish, and I'm not attributing this to Dr. Lacona, but other critical scholars have already suggested that the story of the great catch of fish in John 21 is simply John's remaking of the great catch of fish in a completely different scene prior to his resurrection earlier in Luke. So why can't we suggest that John is modifying the Lucan tradition? The point I'm trying to make here is that the notion of both reliability, if authored by a disciple of Jesus, and independence and independent access to the facts, those ideas have been radically undermined by the methodology endorsed elsewhere by this same scholar. The problem is that, and I think there are other scholars who think this too, scholars will, particularly if they're evangelicals who want to use some of the critical scholarly methods but then retain some core of fact, they will make all of these concessions or even assertions about the way that the gospel authors felt free to do things. But then they'll say, "Oh, but I find this thing in multiple gospels, and maybe there are differences between the stories, so somehow it's multiply attested, so you're all right." I'm pointing out that there are deep problems with that, and I believe very likely that the reason for this, a major reason for this, is a confusion between multiple attestation to the existence of a story of this very general type, which they knew of, and multiple attestation to the truth, multiple attestation to the facts, where they're really going back to the facts and telling us about what happened. Another confusion that I talk about in the Themelios article, I think I talk about it, is a confusion between literary dependence and factual or causal dependence. So let's suppose that we think that John hadn't read Luke. Some scholars think that John had not read Luke. I think John was familiar with Luke. But suppose you take that theory that John like had not even heard the Gospel of Luke read, then you've got no literary dependence between John and Luke. But it doesn't follow that there's no causal or factual dependence, especially if you're allowing for this idea of John knowing of a tradition that lay behind Luke and then modifying that in a fairly radical way. And you're unwilling to stand up and say, no, John wasn't that kind of author. John didn't do that. So again, I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I'm doing so using the methodology of the scholars I'm disagreeing with. I myself reject that methodology. I argue that the authors were scrupulous about their facts. They didn't make these kinds of embellishments of a common tradition. They tried to get it right. And I'm prepared to argue for that. And so I'm being consistent when I point out, for example, that the initial appearance to the disciples in Jerusalem is really multiply attested by John and Luke. I think they're telling about the same meeting there in the first meeting in John and the meeting described there in Luke on the evening of Easter Day. And the fact that they give different details, I think, really does indicate the right kind of independence, namely that they had different access to what happened. John himself, plausibly, if we take him to be John the son of Zebedee, he was there. And Luke, who appears to have spoken to other people who were present at the time of Jesus' resurrection, and Clopas and his companion would be very plausible sources for Luke's story there, because he's the only one who tells about that on the road to Emmaus, and then they are with the 11, although we know it was only 10, but the 11 in the group name sense, when Jesus appears for that first time. So they could have been his sources. So the differences of detail could arise from real different sources to the facts. And it's in Jerusalem. And that really is multiply attested, which I think we should take cognizance of, rather than saying that Luke moved it. So, multiple attestation is not a knight on a white horse, especially not when it's the mere fact that different documents say the same things with some differences. You have to dig in, you have to try to figure out what your theory actually is. You cannot concede a certain theory about the kinds of documents these are and the kinds of relationship that they had to one another, but then back off and say, but this is still okay because it's multiply attested. So I hope that this has been a fun little application of probability and causal reasoning to these documents. And of course, it's going to have other ramifications as well throughout gospel scholarship and also in the evaluation of history and testimony more generally. I'm Lydia McGrew. Please do like and please do subscribe and please do invite other people to do the same to this channel where we're making common sense rigorous.